So we'd like to welcome everyone to another special episode of Presenting Our Presence. We've heard so many voices in these last 3 years and through all of these moon months, and we haven't taken a moment to hear from members of our own team. You've heard from me. I had a special guest episode, and I'm looking forward to hearing more about the co-hosts who've been introducing and stewarding and sharing and visiting with these knowledges and with these special people all along the way. And so, with that, this episode focuses Dr. Sorry, and with that. This episode focuses on the works, the interests, and the passions of Dr. Florence Glanfield. With Dr. Florence Glanfield, would you mind introducing yourself in a way that feels comfortable for you?
Thank you so much, Kyle and Cindy. So I am Florence Glanfield, and I'm a citizen of the Métis Nation of Alberta. And I grew up in the Lac La Biche, Fort McMurray part of this place now called Alberta. And I say that because it was really instrumental in me figuring out who I'm meant to be, given the land that is in those spaces. The land of lots of jack pine and water and, places, little running rivers, and where I grew up fishing and going out hunting with my grandfather and my father. And so that's where I grew up. And I think about this a lot because the road to Fort McMurray was started to be built in 1963, and my father was a forest officer in a ranger station called Wandering River, and so we got to know the engineer who was building Highway 63 to Fort McMurray, and so I grew up knowing what it was like to live where the last place that you could drive to between Edmonton and Fort McMurray was Wandering River, then the road being built and between Wandering River and Fort McMurray, and seeing the transition from a two-lane dirt road to a paved road, two-lane paved road, to a two-lane paved road with shoulders. And then now it's a four-lane highway between. So that is the place where I feel most at home, is in that part of the province between Wandering River, Fort McMurray. And for years, when it was the two-lane road, every time I drove that highway, there was a series of stories for me. The stories of growing up and where we used to pick blueberries, and where my dad and my family would go moose hunting in the fall, and past the big grove of willows where we would look for moose. And those are the stories of the Fort McMurray Highway for me. And they are deeply embedded in who I am as a human.
I see. Wow. There's so much that I don't know about, honestly, both of you. As much as we've been visiting over the course of 3 years, and even Dr. Cindy Gaudet, you've invited me to share in visiting around your kitchen table, and every once in a while I would come in and you would have these prepared, was it sometimes moose, sometimes bison, different wild meats there ready, and so Dr. Cindy Gaudet, I'm curious how you got to know Florence.
So yeah, I had just been hired at Campus Saint-Jean. It was 2017, and part of one of the elements I was hired and thinking about with the Francophone community was on decolonizing, indigenizing, reconciliation more so. And of course, there's certain tensions and complexities. So yeah, it was really the thinking, and part of that, really the university thinking critically about how do we do reconciliation, and imagine that. And we had received some funding, and I was working with a colleague, Florence, what's her name?
Cindy Swanson.
Cindy. Was that how we first met? Or, oh, yes, Cindy, and then the colleague at Campus Saint-Jean who was in math and education.
Yvette D'Entremont.
No, not Yvette. She's left now. She returned to Montreal.
Oh, yes. Oh,
I
that's
see her,
beautiful. So do I. We'll have to find her
her
name.
name.
Oh,
So
yeah,
that's right.
she was.
Maybe it was through Cindy. She was Cindy Swanson was another Métis scholar doing her PhD, and she'd often talk about Florence, and she would. But I think before we met, um, and at the time I had, was working on gathering with women on Indigenous women's knowledge and holding circle and spaces for us to, learn those teachings and those knowledge. And Cindy was always insisting, can come together with these women from Edmonton that mean so much to me. And I had lived out east for 15 years. So I had been away from Edmonton, for those many years. And then one of our colleagues, so Florence's name kept being brought up. And then one of my colleagues said, you need to meet Florence. You need to meet Florence. And as we know, kind of there's certain complexities and it's not all easy thinking about reconciliation in these spaces. And so I can't remember how or when, but it was Cindy and what's her name? Who were both talking in one ear. One was whispering in one ear, and the other one was whispering in the other ear, just insisting, you need to meet and you need to visit with Florence. And we did. And I can't remember the moment, Florence, or where it was. And from then on, this beautiful relationship and friendship and realness and just emerged, so that's probably seven years ago. And I often say that, in many ways, as we do in our Métis kind of co-mentoring practice, Florence, you were mentoring me in that learning about all the complexities of being, like, I'd just gone from graduate study to a professor. Like, I didn't have breathing space or transition space. And so you really provided that space for me to breathe more deeply, to be, and so much encouragement. And in so many ways, it's like that role of kinship with women who would be there for one another. Kind of growing up, it brought me back to recognizing the importance of our aunties in so many different ways, in so many different capacities, those older women who mentored us and who we grew up respecting deeply, and then that collaborative way of learning from one another and with one another. So that's a long answer, Kyle, but that was the beginning of our grandmothers organizing something for us to come together, I'm sure, because I often think that they're part of that.
Exactly. And I think that colleague that you mentioned from Campus Saint-Jean, I think you and she started the same time.
Yes, and we were both co-leading the reconciliation work together. And she spoke to me that she had met you because she was in education, and she was deeply committed, involved in indigenizing math. And she said, Florence, indigenizing mathematics. And so, I've only heard you speak about it a little bit, but every time I think about it, I get excited, and I tell as many people as I can in education, there are other ways to think about math, and please go look to everything that Florence Glanfield is doing. And somehow people's spirits get really lifted up, because for some reason, mathematics has been the hard subject oftentimes, right? And so the possibility of knowing that there's other ways to think about it, there's some kind of relief and release that occurs. Yeah,
Yeah.
can you tell us a little bit more of how that became part of your passion and your expertise and your specialty?
Yeah, that's really, and thank you for the reminder of that beautiful colleague that we had for a short period of time. She was really inspiring as well, given her experiences. You know, I so my early memories is really loving mathematics, what I call mathematics. I started school when I was 5 years old, and I can still remember a lesson that my first grade teacher did in math. And I was in a little country school, a francophone school in a little place called Brainette, Alberta, and we were learning about counting and grouping. And I have this memory. I'm in a classroom. There was a row of grade 1 students, a collection of grade 2 students, and a collection of grade 3 students, all in the same classroom. And the sister that was my teacher had gave us each a little stack of popsicle sticks. And our job was to put the popsicle sticks in bundles of 5 and wrap them with something. I don't know what we wrapped them with now. And then she would call on us to share what we ended up as the result of our little bundle. And every child in the class had the same activity. And in grade 1, we might have less than 10 in our little row because we're just learning. But she would record each of our numbers, and she would record them in the following way. We might say, oh, I had 7 sticks altogether. And she would put 7 up, and then she would write is the equal sign, and I would have 1 bundle of 5 and 2 left over. And she wrote it as 5 plus 2. So in her teaching, she's already teaching us about the meaning of quantity and the meaning of decomposition of that quantity, right? Now I can speak about it in that way as an educator. But if you looked across the 3 grade levels, there would be, there would be a higher number. Maybe it was between 10 and 20 for grade 2s, and maybe it was bigger than 20. But she would just literally walk around and sort of pick up a number of popsicle sticks. And we were all expected to watch what was happening in the other grade levels, right? Because we're in grade 1. So when she gets to grade 3, and perhaps the humans had 22 popsicle sticks, she would write them as 5 plus 5 plus 5 plus 5 plus 2. And then she would introduce it that it could be written as 4 times 5 plus 2. So what it afforded me to do is, looking across the complexity of the numbers, was that I would also begin to notice patterns. Now, so I have this recollection from the time I was 5 or 6 years old in my grade 1 classroom. So in grade 1, I wanted Santa Claus to bring me a blackboard for Christmas so I could do mathematics and teach mathematics to my toys and my younger sister. So I wanted to be a teacher, and it was this amazing first grade teacher, and her name at the time was Sister Nativity. She was my inspiration to become a teacher. And all the way through my grade school, I remember these experiences learning mathematics where I would recognize the patterns. So I was never very good at the memory stuff. And even when we would do, those mad minutes, I guess, or we'd have to have these sheets of paper with all these numbers on it, I spent more time noticing the patterns. And so this was sort of my school life. And in my home life, my grandparents and my mother played lots of card games, and I was taught crib really early on. And it was my job as the learner in the crib games to count everybody's hands. So we would have so what you're doing when you're counting the points in a crib hand is again, you're learning about how numbers are coming together. So, if you have a 7 and an 8, you learn quickly that that's 15. But if you can notice other patterns of there's a decomposition of that quantity. So together, I would say, from the time my mother and grandmother were very quantitative in their thinking. When I was at home growing up, my mother always had me counting with her and engaged with her. And then I go to school and I notice this. So I've always had this deep love of what we now call mathematics. And in high school, I remember sitting in a class one year going, like I think I was in grade 11, and I recognized that, again, the pattern of what I was learning in grade 11 was building on something that I had studied previously. So this was how I came to know and think about mathematics. And I would say I really loved the number and algebra because it's decomposition of all of these quantities. And over time, I did not understand how I was as a Métis person in relationship to mathematics, by the way, because it was hard to understand that. But one of the things that I realized as I began to develop a better understanding of what people called, when I was doing my doctoral work, people started talking about the notion of Indigenous knowledges. And I never had that sensibility because this was just always about the relationships I had with my parents and then, my teachers, because I like them. And I began to realize that in my teaching practice, I actually focused a lot on relationships as well. So I became a high school mathematics teacher. And in my second year teaching, I realized that my students didn't see the relationships between one unit and the next. So I started to make it more visible. I started to name things that they had done previously and what they're doing now. And it seemed to help some of my students because mostly in school mathematics, I think we take it away from the human and it's all in the head and you're expected to memorize and you're not, you're just supposed to finish chapter 1, move on to chapter 2, and they don't connect. So I started making visible the connections that I saw between the concepts. And one of my colleagues said to me one time, the way you think about mathematics is different than the way I do. And I didn't know what my colleague and friend meant at the time. But I think it was this notion of the relationship between concepts. And so now, as I've come to learn more, I think mathematics is it is inherently Indigenous because mathematics itself is all about relationships. And we have a symbol system to describe those relationships. And we have ways to talk about changes in the relationships. We have ways to talk about, I guess I'm going to just say that. It's about relationships. So if I think about mathematics as being all about relationships, then what does that mean for my teaching? And so, in my teaching, I might have, when I first started teaching, I might have said, oh, you have to be able to factor a quadratic expression. Well, what is that, right? But now I think about in my teaching, how is it that my students understand the relationship between factoring a quadratic expression or multiplying two binomial expressions and the multiplication of two two-digit numbers? Or what is the factoring of a quadratic expression in relationship to, the factoring of number? So it's how I think about the relationship now, which is very different. So it took me a long time to name that and find a community. So I used to talk a lot about connections and between concepts. And over time in the mathematics education community, there has been invitation to think about mathematics differently and defining the subject area in different ways, and challenging the taken for granted notion that mathematics is a universal, the language is universal, because they've always said that. Well, everybody knows that 2 + 2 is 4. Well, in fact, it depends on what the 2 + 2 is. It may not be 4, right? And so really thinking deeply about the concepts underlying these number systems. And I think about this so much because I've watched children and adults, get interrupted in their knowing of what they think is to be true in mathematics when you invite them into a different space. And I think about myself as, I have a degree in mathematics. I started that way. And when I first started my doctoral program, I had spent almost 20 years as a teacher and as a math education consultant. So I did all of this work, and I get into my first doctoral class in mathematics education, and the professor puts a bunch of blocks on the floor for us. And he says, I'd like you to build a cube out of these blocks. Nothing I had studied in my formal mathematics training had prepared me for understanding what we were doing as a class and putting these blocks together. And what we were doing was we were building a physical representation of x plus y quantity cubed. And it blew all of us away. There were people who had been practicing, like we were all experienced mathematics educators. So what it also said to me in those moments, it began to challenge me to think about what is this universality that we've begun to think about, and how contextualized mathematics really is. So maybe I should just stop now because I could go on about this, but this is how I came to this piece about indigenizing mathematics.
So incredible to think about it in that sense of disrupting a certain myth, like you said, of this universality, and then to think about it in terms of connections. And yeah, it's like, I was playing crib, Florence, before I left the school at 5 years old. We would play a game of crib. So I've always loved that, but somehow there's this, there's something that changes when we think about mathematics from the way that you are describing in terms of connections, right? And making that visible. And somehow we can all participate, therefore, in this discipline or science of mathematics that has been quite, would you say, hierarchical, or it's been for certain few and not for all. And there's this kind of narrative of who can be good at math and who's not. And it's typically girls, I've noticed. There's a kind of a gendered, I'm not sure if that's true, but I've noticed like the young humans in my life, those who will say I'm not good at math are the young women,
Oh, yeah.
So I'm wondering about if in education, yeah, so you're kind of interrupting those myths as well. And
really interesting, because I started teaching at a time when having women in mathematics was quite extraordinary. And when I was in high school, like I wanted to study all of the high school math courses that were offered and physics courses. And when I was in high school in the 70s, those high school mathematics and physics courses were seen as male courses, as courses for boys. And I had a teacher who was my high school calculus teacher, as well as my high school physics, grade 12 physics teacher. And that would separate the two girls that were in the classroom from all the boys, because he didn't believe we would be able to do the mathematics and the physics. And we weren't the same two in those grade 12 subject areas. Like there was one in my Math 31 class, and she went on to study accounting. And then the other one in the Physics 30 class, I don't remember what she studied, but we were both interested in these fields. So when I started teaching, I wanted to teach Math 31 and be a role model, because I wanted the young women that I was teaching at the time to realize that we can do these subjects. Because still in the 80s, then, when I started teaching, there were incredibly gifted people in mathematics who could think, and humans who identify as women, but would not study high school math because there was continued to be this perception that it was for males only. So I became a really strong advocate. I even convinced my school principal that I should become the Math 31 teacher, because we needed to increase the number of women in Mathematics 31. And one of the ways we could do it is to have a younger female teacher and not have the most experienced male teacher teaching the class. So those are the kinds of pieces that I was always advocating for in terms of mathematics. And certainly, I mean, there is no gene for mathematics. We're all human beings, so we can engage in mathematical thought. But school mathematics makes it seem like there is this, in a way, a fort. There are some people who can and some people can't. And I think it's about what we choose and how we choose to teach, but how we choose to tell kids that they're not able to do the mathematics. And so in teacher education now, I spend a lot of time on trying to disrupt even the narratives within teacher education, because we spend a lot of time in teacher education. There used to be courses, for example, that would diagnose the difficulties learning mathematics. And so we would focus on the errors that the students would make. And it was helpful in some way, but then you're not understanding what the student knows. So how do you frame your language to say, what is it that I see that the person, the learner, knows in this example and in this work, and how can I build off what they know rather than the attitude of how do I fix what they don't know? So the other piece that was highly influential for me in better understanding this was that I had, in my doctoral work, I learned about a new theory of cognition at the time. And it was not, when I first went to teacher education myself, we'd spent a lot of time on behavioralism, which meant you can replicate particular behaviors. And that's sort of what cognition was. Then there was a move while I was away teaching to constructivism, where it's saying that humans are constructing, their own experiences and their understanding. So no matter what kind of instruction you do, there is learning happening, which was very helpful. But then my professors at the time were reading in an area called enactivism, ENACTIVISM. And I spell it out because this theory of knowing was a notion of emergence and a notion of the interaction with the environment. And the environment is not just what we think of land, but it's also the classroom. And that cognition, so every human's contribution in whatever we're asking is that they're bringing forth a world of significance for themselves. So they're making sense of it in all of their structure and bringing forward a world of significance. And this was transformative. So that for me really helped me better understand then, and it resonated with my way of thinking in relation to who I am as a Métis person. So it was transformative in my understanding of mathematics and what I do as a mathematics educator.
That's huge. That's transformative, and I think that fits the inspiration where a lot of Indigenous educators, whether their angle is science, literacy is phys ed, language, whether it's any of these roots, it's that decolonial aspect. That's that Indigenous aspect. It's what's relevant to their Indigenous students in or non-Indigenous students in their classrooms. And so often I've seen different decolonial examples. Craig Allard, for instance, he talks about refracting or light refraction and spearfishing. In the science of water refraction and there's all these different ways of decolonizing mathematics and decolonizing the sciences. And it's the passion that you carry with you, Florence and Cindy, the passion that you carry with you in terms of bringing people together for the sake of storytelling. And Cindy, before we close this call, I just want to give a special mention to Kiokeowen Tachimoan, sorry, Kiokeowen Tachimoan, which was a conference named after Kiowewen, the which you've embodied as and published on as a methodology, the act of visiting, and this conference is developed with the idea of visiting for the purposes of sharing stories, and for that I feel this visit with presenting our presence really does embody and share that bit of visiting for the purpose of sharing our knowledge and our stories as informing that knowledge. And so for me, it's been an absolute honor to be a participant and a listener in this conversation. And I hope that all of those aspiring educators, teachers, learners, tradespeople, plumbers, like people running administration, mothers, aunties, anyone who's there as not necessarily a formal educator, but a mentor for others, that they can conceptualize even the indigenization of their own processes and how they show up and even in their visiting roles. So with that, I really appreciate the conversation that we've had today. Both Dr. Florence Glanfield and Dr. Cindy Gaudet, you continue to inspire me. And with that, I must say, Ei onhle, masicho, and it's been wonderful to hear from you both today.
Oh my goodness, my doorbell just rang and my little pup here is barking. Sorry. Life.
Let's pause. Let's pause.
It's okay. Go, Penny. Go. Yeah, that's fine. Trudy will be happy to see Penny in the recording.